Oh, yeah.
There it is.
I saw Zoom had a touch-up appearance button.
Yes, they do.
I clicked that.
I was playing with that before. I was like, it gives you that kind of Instagram little.
Yeah, it kind of takes off some of the blemishes.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting. I don't know. I decided against it, but it is sort of interesting that it's something
I'm
new.
going full smooth.
Not only the smooth sounds, but now the smooth visuals of
Oh,
Taylor.
yeah.
Look at that. Wow. You guys are all in for a treat on this one. All right. I'm going to let you do your thing.
All right, cool.
You might want to bump up the font slightly there. I'm going to
All right.
there you go. So I know that one's going to be in the chat instantly. So
Boom. Done.
watch that one. All right. Talk to you after.
All right.
Take it away.
All right. So thanks for joining, everybody. I'm Taylor Otwell, creator of Laravel, of course. Thanks to Ian and thanks to the sponsors for organizing the event, Userscape. Always a good time. So my talk's going to kind of be an overview of what's been happening in the Laravel world and then demo some Laravel 7 features. Laravel 7 is scheduled to release next Tuesday, I believe. Every time we talk about Laravel 7, of course, there's always a few tweets about, it's changing too fast. It was just 6. But the reason for that is actually, of course, the semantic versioning change. The release cycle has actually been the same for probably the last 6 or 7 years. Nothing's really changed, but we have to do the numbers a little differently to follow that semantic versioning standard. But this is actually a really easy upgrade. I think for most applications, probably just a few minutes, maybe 10 or 15 minutes. Really, there's only 1 or 2 changes that would affect every application. We have to change a type hint in the exception handler. So if I hop into that thing, we had to change this from exception to throwable. So that affects every application, but thankfully just a really quick change there. But not many other really super big changes that would affect everybody. So go ahead and look through the upgrade guide. It's actually already out on the Laravel website. If you switch right here to the master branch of the documentation, you can go to the upgrade guide, and it's actually already out here. One thing we've actually started doing for the last few releases is sort of separating out some of the high impact changes and medium impact changes, just to be thorough, we have to list every single change we make to the framework, even if it's, a 0.001% chance that you would be affected by this. We have to list it just to be complete. So we try to separate out those high and medium impact changes that you might have a realistic chance of running into when you're upgrading as sort of a breaking change. So go ahead and check that out. But they're all super actually simple to work through. There's nothing really major there. All right. And one thing I think that's helped make Laravel 7 kind of a beefier release, and something I talked about on Twitter a few months ago, is that I've decided to spend all of 2020 just working on open source projects. So of course, that's mainly Laravel related projects in the Laravel ecosystem, things like Laravel and all of our open source things like Cashier and Horizon, Dusk, things like that. But most of my time has actually been spent on the framework itself for the past few months, just implementing some features that I've wanted to see done for a while. And thankfully, we have a good team here at Laravel. So we have Dries, he's been, of course, working pretty much full time on open source stuff, triaging issues, fixing bugs, working on Cashier, working on, all sorts of things. Mohammed's been really helping me hold down the fort on Vapor primarily, improving things, fixing things there, launching new things. And James has been pretty hunkered down on Forge actually for the past month or month and a half. We shipped the database backup feature. You can now configure database backups in the Forge UI. And we just recently shipped log viewing, which is really nice. Right from the Forge UI, you can look at your PHP, MySQL, and application logs. So that's a really convenient feature. You don't have to SSH into the server to look at that stuff anymore. And so I've just been kind of focusing on a bunch of open source stuff. A lot of the stuff has been Laravel 7 stuff, but even actually I've started working on some Laravel 8 stuff, which would be in the summer at Laracon US. So not everything that I've been working on is in this presentation. Some of it I've been saving because it's not quite ready yet. But I'm going to go ahead and walk through some of the 7.0 stuff in this talk. So the first thing I wanted to mention that kind of coincides with Laravel 7 is Laravel Airlock. I'm not going to really go through a whole demo of this because I think it would be a little more time consuming, but I wanted to just touch on it and mention it. We will tag a stable release of Laravel Airlock when we release Laravel 7. And if you're not familiar with what this is, maybe 2 months ago, I was just a little bit, I was looking through, you know, how are people authenticating their single page applications with Laravel? So that was one use case. And then the other use case was kind of thinking through the existing API token authentication stuff that we had in Laravel. And I wasn't super happy with either of these situations because we have Passport, of course, which is a full OAuth sort of integration with Laravel, very powerful, lots of features. And, you know, you have to think about different grant types and you need 5 database tables to work with it and stuff. It's a pretty robust package. And even when using Passport, there was sort of confusing and conflicting information online about how you should authenticate your single page application using Passport. Some people were using JWT packages to authenticate their SPAs. Just people doing various things. There was sort of no consensus and sort of no official answer from the Laravel side on how you should solve this problem. So Laravel Airlock really solves 2 problems. It solves the SPA authentication situation with sort of an official, recommended, and keyword simple way to authenticate your SPA with Laravel. But then it also provides a more robust API token management thing. So you don't, and they're sort of, you can use them either or. You don't have to use both features to use Airlock. So you might not be building an SPA at all, but you want some nice like API token management, maybe for your mobile application or something like that. You can use Airlock for that. Or maybe you don't need the API token piece, but you need the SPA authentication. You can use Airlock just for that side. All right. So, and how it works behind the hood is, you know, in real quick rundown is when your SPA makes a request from your first party SPA application, we can just use normal session cookies, just like you're used to with Laravel. And then all third party clients like a mobile application, or, you know, maybe you have an SDK that you let third parties make calls to your application using that, you can use the API tokens. So it's actually a really simple under the hood package. But go ahead and go out there, and if those use cases sort of resonate with you and you need a solution there, go read this documentation. Again, it's out on the master branch, and there's a little introduction here to how it works, and of course installation and how to get started. But go ahead and read that and check that out. And again, we'll be tagging that next week. Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted to touch on with Airlock, and we'll just go ahead and move on to some other features now. So the first Laravel 7 feature I wanted to talk about is this custom cast feature. So this feature has a long history in Laravel of people attempting it, people wanting it, and even I had a pull request open for this feature back in 2016. And I kind of just, you know, this winter, I think back in December, I was kind of just got tired of hearing about it. I was like, I'm just going to take another crack at this. I'm just going to push it into the framework. I'm not going to make any big, not going to have a lot of big debate or discussion about it, but I just resurrected my old pull request and kind of touched it up and cleaned it up. And I think it turned out pretty cool. So I'll kind of show you how this works. And what it lets you do is, of course, Laravel has built-in cast types already. Like if you go into your model, and have like a cast property, you see this date time. So this is already one of the built-in casts, but you were never able to sort of define your own cast types until now. And there's a few different ways that you might use this. So a lot of people might use them for like a value object. So you can see here that I can set the address property to this address value object, or this options property to this options value object. So how does this work under the hood? So let's kind of jump into this with this options object first. And you'll see on that user model, I've got on the options column, I've attached it to this options cast class. And so let's go ahead and pop that open. There's no sort of defined place for where you might put this. So I've just created an app cast directory. And within this options file, we have our cast class. Now, one important thing to note is this is not the class that you have to cast to. I'll show you what I mean. So I actually have a separate app options object. That's my actual value object. This is just sort of like a caster class that manages translating to and from that object. So cast classes implement this cast attributes interface, which just defines two methods, get and set. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the get method first. And so what this does is, if I look at my table, let's go to my user table. Right now I have this options column, which is just an empty array. And so we want to turn that into a options value object. So what we do, we get some information here in the arguments, the model, the key, which is the column name, the current value, the raw value that's kind of stored in the database. We get that. And then we get all of the other attributes as an array, because sometimes you might need them, which you'll see in another example. So all we really want to do here is return a new options value object. Again, that's the app options object. I've just aliased it to that. And then JSON decode that value into an array. All right, and then all this options value object does for this example is it sort of implements array access, so we can treat it like an array, but we could, in theory, put other helper methods on this object. All right, and then if we look at the set method, this just needs to translate that options object back into what we want to store in the database. So the value right here is going to be an instance of that options value object, and I'm just going to JSON encode it because that's what we want to store in the database. And if we look at that options value object, I had already defined the JSON serialize method and implemented the JSON serializable method, so we can call JSON encode on that object safely. And basically, think of this class as just a translation layer. It translates between your raw database values and whatever you want to cast to. It might not even be a value object. For instance, you could have like an uppercase cast that all it does is like string to upper on a value. You don't have to cast to a value object necessarily. You can cast to primitive types as well. All right, so that's kind of what that looks like. And now when we set this, I'm setting it here. That's going to trigger that set method there in our cast class, which is going to JSON encode the value, and we're good to go. All right. Now let's dig into another example of this address cast. This one is a little bit, this is going to use the other attributes on the model like I talked about. So if I pop open that cast class, now our address value object, we want to sort of combine multiple different attributes into this value object, because an address is made up like, maybe address line 1, address line 2, a city, a state, a country, and those are all separate columns in our database. So we need to combine those into a single value object. All right. And so within this get method, we see if one of the attributes is null, we're just going to return null. So the address could be null. But if we have the information, we'll return a new address value object. And this is where I said we want to dig into the other attributes that were given. So we're going to use all 5 of those attributes to build the value object. And now, so that's how we get it. That's pretty simple. Now, how do we translate that back into the model? In this case, we need to sort of push to multiple columns within the model. So from the set, instead of just returning a single value, we're going to return an array of column and value pairs here. So this is going to translate it back into sort of our database storage form of the address. All right, so we're just going to return the column names and then dig those values out of the value object that we're given. All right, so that's our sort of translation layer that we've written, and now we can get and set those value objects. So you'll see here in this example, I'm just going to find the user. We saw earlier that my options was actually empty, so we're going to set it to a new options object with these options. Maybe I want notifications turned off, and we'll just generate a random token in there just to kind of fill it with some data. And then we'll set our address to a new address. This is not anywhere I lived in the past, even though it is my hometown. I don't even know if this is a real address, but we'll set this to a value object, and then we'll save the user. And then we'll just return the user and kind of inspect what we have here. All right, so let's hit this route, set cast, make that a little bigger. And you can see here that our options have been set. They're no longer empty. We have notifications false in our random token. And you can see that all of those values from our address object were pushed into the model. You can see that there. And if we look at the table, let's go ahead and refresh that. You can see it pushed those values into the table. Can I make this bigger? I'm not sure I can make that any bigger, but on the options, you can see that it actually stored that JSON array there. So pretty sweet to be able to write your own cast objects in this way, or custom casts. And some people have asked, as I was building this, what's the difference between this and just using a mutator? And there actually is one important difference for sure. Is one, they're easier to share across models, but then two, they work a little differently. So check out this example of modify cast. So I'm going to pull the user, and then I can actually modify these objects right here. So I'm going to set some different values in that notifications, or in that options object, and I'm going to mutate the address, and then I'm just going to call save. And what's cool and what's different about this than mutators is these changes that I made to these objects are going to be synced back into the model before it's saved. And so if I hit this modify cast route, what we would expect to see is, this address change and some different options here. Let's see if that happens. Okay, so you can see that this was indeed synced back to the database, and that address line 1 has changed to 110 Broadway Avenue. And of course, if we look in the table, that's changed here as well. So that's the difference with mutators, because with mutators, you have to kind of picture it in your head, but if this was a mutator, every time I call user address, it's sort of creating a new address object that the model has no idea. It doesn't keep track of that. It doesn't sync back the changes at all. And so you couldn't do something like this with mutators. Your changes would not be synced back to your model. With custom cast, Eloquent kind of keeps track of those custom cast value objects and then syncs back, which basically just loops through them and calls that set method on your translation layer before you save, or before you update or do some other mutation to the database. All right, so that's an important difference between this and mutators. This next example, I don't think it's going to be a common thing you might do, but I wanted to show it to you because it's kind of a unique type of custom casts. So you might imagine in your mind, the most prime example of this I can think of is sort of hashing, where it's sort of a one-way cast. So you're hashing it on the way in, but when you get it out from the model, you don't want to do anything to it necessarily, because you can't unhash a hashed value. You can't really easily unhash a bcrypt hashed value. So this is a one-way cast. So how this is implemented is, let me look at my user here. I have this hash cast, and I can feed it an argument here, an algorithm. You can pass custom arguments into your translation cast layer, which is just going to do an MD5 hash on this attribute. So if I pop open that hash, you'll see this implements a different interface. It says cast inbound attribute. So this is a smaller interface. You only actually need to implement the set method. There's no get method, because we're not doing anything on the way out from the model, only on the way in. And we're just going to check if we have an algorithm. If we don't, we'll just use a default, a bcrypt. If we do, we'll call the PHP hash function and feed it that algorithm and the value. All right, so that's a simple example of an inbound cast. And so if I call this, secret is null right now, inbound cast, you can see it was set to a hashed value. And if I did return user secret, kind of on the fly here, you can see it, I just get the hash back. There's no mutating behavior when I get the value. All right, so that's inbound cast. Sort of a edge case. I don't know that you would typically use this very often, but if you're writing any kind of hashing type cast, you would need that. And then I wanted to show you one more cast example before we moved on, which kind of elaborates on that parameter thing I mentioned earlier when I talked about the hash. This is an example where I have an order model, and we have a couple columns on this order table. One is shipping total, which is sort of the shipping amount in cents. The other is the shipping currency, which is like USD or EUR for euros, or whatever our currency is. And maybe we want to cast this to a money object, which is another sort of common type of use case for a value object, I guess. What this looks like is we want this to be reusable across models. So if we hop into our model, I'm going to use the money cast, but I'm going to feed it which column represents the amount, and then I'm going to feed it which column represents the currency. And you can imagine on different models, or even on the same model, maybe you have, you know, a tax total where you want to use the same cast, except this is tax total and this is tax currency. You know, you want to feed the same cast different values or different columns. So if I hop into that cast, I'll actually receive, you know, the string column name and amount, string column name and currency. And then in my get, I can use that when I dig into the attributes array to extract the attributes I need. So in this get, I'm going to return a new money object. This is using the money PHP library. I'm going to give it the amount, and then I'm going to give it the currency out of my attributes. When I set, I'm going to return, I have two columns, remember, so I need to return an array. It's going to be the amount column and the currency column, and then I'm just going to get, you know, the integer value of the money object and the currency string of the money object. All right, so that, for example, when I hit this route and we retrieve that order, we dump it out, we have a money object here, and our, you know, values look good. We have USD. And then if I want to update it, I'll just comment that out. I can set shipping total to a new money object. In this case, I'll change it to euros. I guess this would be 50 euros since this is in cents. I'll save it, and then I'll just return the order here so we can see. And you can see this is updated. The money PHP library implements JSON serializable, so it's kind of implementing its own serializable behavior. That library has that as a final class, so I have no customization options there at all. But you can see that it was updated and changed to euros. All right, so I just wanted to show that to you as an example to demonstrate how you might use these parameters to make your cast translation classes more reusable. All right, so that's custom classes. Pretty powerful feature that gives you a lot of options and different ways to cast various things. The documentation is, of course, already live for those on the master branch, so you can go read more about that if you want to. All right, moving on from that feature entirely, I want to talk about Blade components. So this was a pretty big new feature that I worked on with feedback from a variety of people. It was originally inspired by two things. One was a tweet from Jeffrey Way where he talked about he had sort of a UI widget that he wanted to be responsible for its own data retrieval and things like that. And he sort of wanted that encapsulated in a single class. And then also inspired by Spotty's Blade X library, which lets you use HTML tags to render Blade components. The main similarity between this and the Blade X package is mainly just the HTML tags. The rest of it works fairly differently, I would say, than that package. So if you've used that package before, don't necessarily bring your assumptions into this as to how this will work. It works a little bit differently. All right, so to get started, I've written this route / components, which will give us a little bit of a UI to look at here. This is using Tailwind. It's not using the new Tailwind UI, which released today. This is a little bit before that. But what I want to show you is let's dig into this view. So components.blade.php. I'm going to close out some of these other tabs here. All right, and I've got a variety of components that I want to walk through. So Blade has always supported components. It used to look like this, and this is still actually supported. And you would have like in component here, and you could have slot content here, just like that. Now, you can imagine that being translated to these tags, which begin with X dash. So that's a Blade component tag, and this is going to render the panel component, and we can pass props to it. I mean, almost similar to a view component, you might say. Now, there are several different ways to write the component. So this panel component is a class-based component. So I want to show you what that looks like. Within my app directory, there's a view directory, components, and there's that panel that we were just looking at. In the constructor, we can accept some properties. So if I jump back into this components, let me get rid of my changes here. This components blade file, there's that title property. That's going to be passed into the constructor here that I can use it. And we'll see how I use it in just a second. And this other dummy service property, I just put this in here to show you that you can actually ask for things out of the dependency injection container in your component class. You just list them before your other properties that are coming in from your HTML, and they'll automatically be injected. So if you need some sort of data repository to retrieve some data or some other object to make this component work, you can just ask for them in your constructor and they'll be injected. All right. And then if I scroll down, every component has a render method. In this case, we're returning what view do we want to render when this component is rendered. In this case, I have a blade template in resources, views, components, panel. And this is what's going to be rendered when that component is rendered. And what's cool is some of the attribute management stuff here. So of course, there's where we're showing our title. And so how did the view get this title? And what's nice is every public property of that panel class is automatically made available to the blade component. So you can see that title here was public, so that's automatically going to be made available. Now, you could also pass the data explicitly here if you wanted to, but you don't necessarily need to. Every public property and every public method will actually be available to the components template. All right, so I can just echo it there. I can echo my slot. This works just like the old Syndex for components. So everything that's sort of within that panel, it gets injected into the slot, and then I can echo it. And let's take a look at this attribute stuff. So when you looked at this, you might have noticed that, yes, I have a title property, but I also had a class here. And this class was not in the constructor for the panel. And so what happens is any HTML attributes that are not in the constructor for the panel get put into an attribute bag and is available via the attributes object. And so what this lets you do is let the developer, if you're shipping a package of UI components that use this syntax, it lets the developer, the consumer, specify extra attributes like the class, maybe some Livewire or Alpine.js attributes, or I don't know, the name of like an input control. And then you can pass them down into your component and render them here. So I'm going to say attributes merge. And what this does is I can specify some default values for any of these HTML attributes. So whenever I use this panel component, I always want these classes to be there. But I don't necessarily want to specify things like the margin or things like that. I want that to be up to the end user so I can reuse it. And what this is going to do is merge in any of the sort of consumer provided attributes, in this case, max width 2XL, with my defaults. And so when I render this and I go look at the source for this panel, if I can find it here, I think this is it right here. You can see I've got my defaults, my PX6, PY4, border, rounded LG, blah, blah, blah. But then at the end, it's merged in that max width 2XL that I specified when I was consuming the component. And so that's actually really nice because in any other attributes I put on here would also be built in as well. So like if I had a required or autofocus attribute, which we'll see in a minute, those would also be passed through. All right, so that's a really handy feature. You'll definitely need that if you're trying to build any sort of reusable UI components in your application. And that was really cumbersome to do with the old at component, in component syntax. I mean, really cumbersome. All right, so that is a class-based component. Now, sometimes you might feel like, I just got a simple component. Do I really need to make a full PHP class just to render it, blah, blah, blah. And so what Dries did, he was actually really passionate about this feature, is he contributed this concept called anonymous components. And this is where, like you see I have this XForm component. We just use conventions to say, okay, I don't see a class that's associated with this. And I should have mentioned earlier, we use conventions to determine what class to render up here as well. So when you say XPanel, we'll actually look in app view components for a panel class by convention, and you can override that. You can explicitly specify what class a component corresponds to. But by default, we look here and say, oh, okay, there's a panel class. This is what class I'll use to render this component. But sometimes if we don't find a class, we'll say, okay, I don't see a form class in app view components. But if I look in views components, I do see a form class or a form template here. So that this must be an anonymous component. And so we'll just go ahead and render that without any class at all. All right. And so if I dig into this, there's some interesting stuff going on here. So since we don't have a class, how do we know what is data and what is attributes in this case? And Caleb Porzio had a really nice solution to this that he sent me, where he said we could put a props directive at the top of the anonymous component, which this says, okay, these are the variables. These are my sort of data variables that I expect to be available to me. So action, method for when I'm building the form, and the error bag for displaying my validation errors, which I'm using another component to do there. And this is kind of a self-closing component, which also wasn't possible using the at component in component. But anyway, these props will be available as variables, and everything else will be in the attribute bag, which you'll see I'm just echoing here. I don't need to use that merge stuff. If I'm not trying to merge in any defaults, I can just echo the attribute bag and it will build out all the attributes for that HTML element. All right. So I can say stuff like, form method post action components. And it will automatically render that anonymous component. And those are my available values. And it will build the form. In this case, I've used this form component to sort of be a nice wrapper around building an HTML form. It automatically puts like the save button at the bottom. It automatically does the CSRF protection. It automatically does like the method. And this is not built into Laravel. This is just something I built for this presentation, but it's an example of something you might use components for to sort of dry up your markup. And then anytime I want to build this kind of form, I can just do X form and pass in the slot of what my form contents are going to be. And I don't have to worry about the save button, the at CSRF call, the at method call. It's just kind of ready to go for me. And it looks like nice HTML markup. All right, so that's an anonymous component. That's really nice. Most of the time, you probably can just use an anonymous component, I would say, unless you need some other dependency or you're going to use your component as sort of a view model layer. Because like I said, every public method is also available on the component. And I'll give you an example of that real quick before we move on. So like if I go back to this panel and I make a public method, we'll just call it like work. And maybe this returns hello world. All right, so I've got a public method on this panel. And if I go back here and I go into that panel component, let's just say like in the title, every public method is available as an invocable variable. So I can just call the work variable, which will invoke that method. And I'm kind of shooting from the hip live here. Call to undefined function hello world. Okay, if they return a value, a raw primitive value, you don't have to invoke them. But if they accept arguments, you can invoke them and pass stuff to them. All right, so I think I'll give you an example of that, like string. In this case, we'll just return string. And then now I can probably pass stuff to it. All right, so it showed hello. So that's how methods are made available to you in your components. All right, a little live coding there that wasn't planned. All right, hopping back into this component. So we've seen the class-based components, the anonymous components. I want to show you one more way you can define your component template, which is an inline view component. So this is similar to anonymous components in that you only need one file, but in this case, instead of a blade template, you only need a class. So if I look at this form control component class in app view components, okay, what is this rendering if it's not returning a blade template or a view file? You can just return a raw template string right from your render method. In this case, I'm just using Blade's Heradoc syntax or Heradoc syntax. And the nice thing in Sublime, I don't know if other editors are like this, but if I specify my delimiter as like a language, I get syntax highlighting here. So that's kind of nice. But in this case, I'm just returning, a snippet of Blade where I can echo values, echo attributes, all the same stuff that we saw before. But in this case, it's just all in the PHP class directly. So, I mean, this is nice if you need a little bit of logic in your component class, but it's just such a simple view. You don't really want to make a whole separate Blade template and have two files to keep track of, blah, blah, blah. So in this case, you can just put it all in one file and still get some nice helper kind of view model style functionality. All right, so that's the form control. That sort of wraps up this label and form input. And then finally, within that form control, I have a input component. This is an anonymous component, so I won't spend too much time on it, but it just has a prop of value. We merge in some default classes. We show the value. And you'll see on the component side, I had required an autofocus here as attributes. And if we look at the source, you can see one of them right here. It automatically passed those down to the input because I echoed the attributes value and things like that. So that's basically this whole piece of UI was built entirely using the Blade components. So, you might imagine at your own company, maybe you're using Tailwind UI, and you want to sort of wrap up things in components like forms and buttons and inputs. This is a really great way to do that. And you still get some really nice things like being able to specify classes on them, passing in other attributes, maybe having some view model type functionality if you're using the class components. Really sort of supercharges that whole Blade component functionality and gives you a lot more power. I mean, I think Caleb may show more component stuff later in his talk with Livewire and Alpine. But this just gives you a taste of what you can do with it. And we saw earlier that I had some validation errors, components. So if I try to fill out this form, you can see that validation error component rendering there. Again, this is all documented on the master branch. So hop out there and read all about it. There's no breaking changes here. All of your old component syntax will still work. This is all built on top of that. So we're not going to remove that old syntax. This just translates down into at component, at slot, things like that. So you don't have to worry about that disappearing on you. This is just sort of a nice layer on top of it that makes a lot more powerful things possible. All right. So I think that's probably enough time on this feature. Need to keep moving on here, but a cool new Blade feature there. Moving along to an HTTP client. So there's been no built-in way in Laravel to sort of make HTTP requests to other services in the past. People have always used Guzzle directly or whatever other HTTP client. In Laravel 7, we actually have a very simple HTTP client built right in. This is actually built on top of Guzzle. We did not write our own custom HTTP client, which would be a nightmare. This just uses the Guzzle package that many of us were already using, but puts a nice sort of developer experience layer on top of it, inspired by Adam Wathan's ZTTP library. It takes that, it has all the same features as that, and then adds some really cool new testing stuff that I want to show you real quick. So, why not just use Guzzle directly? Well, the problem is that I can never even remember what the methods are or what the array options are to do that, like to do like basic auth or pass form parameters or attach files or anything like that. So it's just kind of cumbersome and hard to remember. This is a much terser syntax that's a little bit more memorable, and some other nice features which we'll look at. So in this example, I'm just going to say HTTP : with headers, pass it some headers that I want to send in the request, make a post. And now by default, if I don't do anything else, this is going to assume I'm just posting JSON data to this endpoint. So I don't have to specify like application JSON, the content type, or whatever else. That's all sort of automatic. And then I'm just going to dump out some of the results of these helper methods, and we'll just kind of look through them. So let me share this so I can make this request. So if I call HTTP, all right, so we got a response. We can dump out response JSON to just quickly get the JSON version of the response. There's no like JSON decode response, get body, cast that to a string, get content, blah, 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 blah. Just response JSON gets the JSON, just like the good old days. Response status, integer status code, response successful is going to tell you, what is it, a 200 level status code. Response client error is going to tell you, was it a 400 level status code, server error, a 500 level status code. And then I could dump out the headers as an array of the response. And then I can also just access, if I get JSON back, I can just access that directly off the response as if it was an array. So the response implements array access, so I can just dig right into those JSON values. I don't need to decode the body or worry about that. Really nice, really convenient, and easy to get started with, easy to remember. By default, one difference between this and Guzzle is it will not throw an exception if you get a 400 or 500 level error back. If you want that behavior, something you can do is when you get the response, just call response throw. This will throw the exception if there was an error, just like the Guzzle behavior. But by default, it does not do that. You just inspect the response and do what you want to do. All right. So that's the HTTP client. There's more methods in the documentation. If you go out to the website, and look at that master branch, it's under digging deeper, HTTP client. It will show you how to do things like basic authentication, with basic auth, with digest auth, with token. There's a few other methods out there you can go and look at. That's available now out there on the website. All right, so I want to show you some of this testing stuff. This is if you want to post your data as a form instead of JSON. You can say HTTP as form post, really simple. And down here's the testing stuff I want to show you. So sometimes you might want to stub out, you don't want to make real HTTP requests in your test. You just want to return some dummy responses. This is really easy to do. So I've set up this route called HTTP test right here. It's just going to make an HTTP request with headers to this endpoint, pass some JSON data, and then it's going to return the token value that we get back from the server as JSON. Now, I have a test. Maybe I don't really want to execute this HTTP request. What I can do is just call HTTP fake. This is the most simple way to do it. I'm going to pass it a callback, which will be invoked when an HTTP request is made, and I can return any response I want here. So return HTTP response and some JSON response token equals test token. I'm going to call that endpoint that I just showed you in my routes file. I'm going to assert that I see the test token. And then you can also do some cool stuff here where I can inspect the request that was made. So I want to make sure, maybe I want to make sure I set the correct header in my request. So I can say HTTP assert sent. This is kind of just like, bus assert dispatched or event assert dispatched, stuff like that. So I say assert sent, and I get the request and I can inspect it. I can say, did the request have this header? Did the request have this data parameter? And how this works is at least one request has to match this criteria for this test to pass. It's okay if other requests had different attributes on them, but at least one request has to match this criteria. So if I run this test, you can see that it passes. It did not make any HTTP requests at all. It was all faked. Okay, so let's look at another example. Maybe you have a test that hits multiple URLs. Okay, kind of like this route right here where it hits like a GitHub URL, it hits a Laravel.com URL, it hits a Google.com URL, and all these various, all in the same request. If I look at my test, when I call HTTP fake, I can actually pass in an array of URL patterns that will match. So I say any request to github.com/anything, star just as a wildcard, return this response, hello from GitHub. Anything to laravel.com/star, return this response, hello from Laravel. And then when I have just a star, that's like all other fallback requests that don't match those criteria above, return some fallback response, maybe an empty 200 response. In this case, I'm doing hello from fallback. And then when we hit this route, we should of course expect to see, hello from GitHub, hello from Laravel, hello from fallback, which was returned from this route right here. All right, so we can call that test. That passes, no HTTP requests were made, and we're able to stub out different URLs and return different responses really easily with very little code. Now, sometimes you might have an HTTP sequence. This is the last example I want to show you here of testing, where I want to return, on the first call to laravel.com, I want to return this response. On the second call, I want to return a different response. So you can kind of queue up a sequence of stubbed responses using the HTTP sequence method. And if I look at that route, I'm just making two calls to laravel.com, first and second, and returning the JSON for them. And so we should see, test token 1 and test token 2 right here when we assert on our JSON. And that passes as well. So you can queue up a sequence of responses for either a certain URL or all URLs or whatever you want to do. All right, so some really powerful testing functionality here that makes it really easy to just stub out some HTTP endpoints. Previously you might have wrapped an HTTP call in a service class called github.php so that you could inject that into something and mock that so you could test the response, blah, blah, blah. This is really a faster way to have a simpler way to stub out your HTTP responses rather than going through all of that. All right, so that's the HTTP client and testing functionality. Moving on, I'm getting short on time here, but the fluent strings, this is a new feature in Laravel 7. All of the existing string helpers are still there, but this is a really nice way to have a more fluent way to interact with them. So anytime I do string of, I get a value of Illuminate support stringable, and then I can chain on a lot of these fluent string methods and not have to wrap them from the outside in, so to speak. So I'm going to say trim, start it with this, finish it with this, uppercase it, replace the matches where it matches this regular expression value, replace that with online 2020, and so I should transform this into uppercase Laracon online 2020 with a fire emoji on both ends when we hit this route. Strings. Ooh, slow here. I'm going to close this out. There we go. Laracon Online 2020. All right. So a really nice way to interact with strings in a more fluent way. There is a lot of methods available to you here. So go out to the docs again, master branch, digging deeper under helpers. There's a fluent strings category, and every method is documented right here. You can go ahead and explore those, in your free time, because there's a lot of stuff available to you there. All right, so that's the fluent string feature in Laravel 7. Route model binding customization. This is a really cool feature that I wrote back in December, I think. And I want to show you a little bit about how it works. There's two parts to it. So I'm going to start dumping out the SQL queries that we're making just so that we can look at them a little bit. But this is the first new feature here where previously you couldn't customize what a route model binding, what column it was using to look up your model. So it was just always using the value that was returned by some model method like get route key or something like that, which was normally ID. Now you can just have like colon and then a column name. So I'll look up the post by the slug. So in my database table, I have a post table. It has a slug of Laracon that I've stubbed out here. So I can just hit post/Laracon and it will retrieve that post using its slug. All right. And so that's cool. That's the first new feature. It's easier to customize that. That's the majority of that feature. But then there's a second thing built on top of that where sometimes, and I had the situation when I was building Laravel Vapor, you have a URL that looks something like this, where you have user/1 for my user and then post/Laracon. And now what you really want to happen is I want this slug. I want to look at the post by the slug. Yes. But I want to constrain that to only posts made by the user that was right here. And if you go out to Stack Overflow, you'll see lots of questions about how to do this. And I think it was technically possible, but it was pretty cumbersome to do it. And so what we do now is if I hit this route, if I see that you're customizing your route model binding parameter, and I see that it's also a child of another parameter, we can use conventions to just automatically scope that query for you now. So for instance, I see that you have a user here. I'm going to look for a post, the plural version of this, the post relationship on that user. And then I'm going to use that to scope this post lookup. So you'll see the query ends up being select from post where post user ID equals this. So, it's scoped to that user that was earlier in the URL, and where the slug equals this. So that's just very convenient. I used it I needed it in Vapor because we have a URL that's something like project/1/environment/production, where it was like, I want to inject the production environment, but I need it to be scoped by that project. So I could have really used this feature actually when I was building Vapor. And instead I had to do some big workaround. But now that's all automatic scoped route model binding. Again, this is documented if you go out to the routing documentation on master branch. Let's see. Route or queues, max exceptions. I'll show this really quickly. This is a new feature for queued jobs. Again, this is a situation that we had in Vapor that we needed to do some pretty cumbersome workarounds, but Mohammed recently implemented a built-in way to do this in Laravel. So I have this process podcast job. And in this example, I don't want to really handle this job unless I can obtain a Redis lock. And if I can't obtain the lock, I want to release this job for 10 seconds. Now, that's all well and good. Okay, so I say, I'm going to try that 25 times to get a lock. Now, there are situations where let's say I do get a lock, and then I do some logic in here and something goes wrong, and it throws an exception. And maybe like some external API is down, and it's just failing, and it will fail 25 times. And so what I really wanted to do in Vapor was say, okay, yes, I want to try this job 25 times as long as I'm releasing it cleanly. But if I'm getting exceptions, I only want to allow 3 exceptions before I fall or before I fail the job entirely. So 3 unhandled exceptions. And this new max exceptions property on your job lets you do that. So in this case, it will let me release the job 25 times, but if it gets 3 exceptions that were not handled, it's going to fail the job. So you can, if I fire off this route here, That's done. Go here to my application. Let me make that a little bigger. And fire up my queue worker. I gotta get rid of that SQL query dump. Okay, it failed up here. Let me comment that out and do that again. Earlier we were dumping out all the queries for this route model binding stuff. All right, queue the job, queue, process, and then it failed because it got 3 unhandled exceptions. So if you have that situation, really handy feature, check that out. You can now chain closures in your job chains. So we've supported job chaining for a few releases, but you had to chain a series of classes like job classes. Now you can just queue chained closures. So this closure will be queued and executed, and then if that's successful, this closure will be executed in order, in sequence. The second one will not process until the first one finishes. So I'll go out to my log file and clear that. And if we hit this chain route, that will queue, will process, and you see I get chain 1 and then chain 2 a second later. So you can now chain queued closures really easily. This was another feature that Mohammed implemented really recently. I think this was actually just merged in yesterday. All right, moving along very quickly. There's been improvements to the mail template, the default markdown mail template. So I'm going to fire off that email and then go out to mailtrap.io. It had a pretty generic look, but we used some kind of Tailwind color schemes and put the Laravel logo there at the top. And you can, of course, customize all that, customize the colors, but it just has a little bit more of a modern look, fresher look out of the box. You can just, slap your logo in there and you're good to go. It already looks pretty good, better than it used to. All right, so that's the improvements of the mail template. Query time cast. This is a cool little feature that was a community contribution. Let me hit this query raw route. And what I want you to see here is I'm selecting all the columns from the user, but then I'm also doing this kind of advanced select from another table where I want to get the user and I want to get the last posted at timestamp, which is going to be the timestamp of the last post they created, the last blog post, let's say, which is going to be the max created at from the post table where the user ID equals this user ID. All right, so you can see this works. It works fine, but when I look at the users created at timestamp, it's a date time cast versus the last posted at. Since the last posted at is not an actual attribute on the user's model, it doesn't have any cast set up to it. So now it's like a different date format. But now you can have sort of real-time cast where I can do the same query, but say with cast last posted at as a date. And now if I hit this query cast route, it's going to cast that in the same way. So I can attach any cast to this. It could be a JSON cast, a custom cast that I wrote, whatever I need to do. And it's going to automatically cast that. So that's really nice. You can do the real-time casting on columns that are not part of the model. All right, stub customization, kind of wrapping up the features here. This was, again, a very highly requested feature. You can now do it in Laravel 7 if you do cancel out that queue. Artisan stub publish. I've already run it here, so I'm not going to run it again. It will put out a stubs directory here where, like, for example, I can go into model.stub and customize how I want my models to look when I run artisan make model. So in this case, I've added this guarded as an empty array. And now, like, if I come out here and do artisan make model flight, it has that customization that I added to my stub file right here. So you can now customize, various stubs, controllers, jobs, tests, migrations, models, and customize how you want your project's files to be generated, and it will respect those customizations. Really handy new feature. Dries has made some route cache speed improvements. If you have a very large application, say with like over 1,000 routes and you're using route caching, the route matching logic is up to twice as fast in Laravel 7. So like a hello world benchmark on that kind of application will be twice as fast as Laravel 6. We're using some new features that are in Symfony's routing layer to do some really high efficiency regular expression matching on all of your routes at once. So instead of checking 800 routes or 800 regular expressions, we just check one regular expression that is much faster than checking 800 separate ones. Some serious significant speed improvements there with route caching, thanks to Dries and the upstream Symfony contributions. And then finally, last feature I want to show you here is we've integrated Barry's popular Laravel cores package. So if you go out to the composer file, you'll see that by default, we have fruitcake/Laravel cores. This is kind of similar to how we integrated with Chris Fidal's trusted proxy package. And now within your config directory, out of the box in Laravel 7, there is a cores.php file where you can customize all your cores, which is cross-origin resource sharing values that you want for your application. And by default, Laravel will automatically handle those options requests for cores for your application and return the configured headers that you have specified here. So it's just one less step to get up and running with cores in Laravel. You can just do it right here in a kind of first-party configuration file, and it will all be taken care of for you. All right, so that is a seriously whirlwind tour of some of the highlights of Laravel 7. There are some smaller things that I didn't get time to really demo, but this is definitely the high points, and I think the main things you might be interested in. Again, it will release next week, and I hope you enjoy it and enjoy these new features.
All right, that was amazing. I think that's the thing with Laravel, that it's amazing how whenever there's a Laravel release, it's like there's just stuff you had last week that you needed that's in the Laravel release. That to me is the best part always. I'm like, oh yeah, I need that. I just did something else different last week. I want that now.
Yep.
It's like still you still manage to have the pulse of the developer, I think, better than anything else,
Yeah, that's good.
That is important. But a lot of frameworks don't value that. And I think
that's true.
Obviously does. So.
I think it's key that we're building big applications on it all the time.
Yeah. You guys are in there using it, which makes a huge difference. It's not like theoretical.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Taylor.
All right. See y'all later.